Good afternoon. I'm Mariana Mancuso, and I am so excited to welcome all of you to Ram Chat. Today's Ram Chat conversation is an exciting one, as I'm sure you can tell by my enthusiasm. There are a lot of us out there wondering if there's a better way for our political system to work. Thankfully, there are people like Lee Drutman who has dedicated his career to finding that better way. Drutman is a senior fellow in the political reform program at New America. He's the author of Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, the case for multi-party democracy in America, and winner of the 2016 American Political Science Association's Robert A. Dahl Award, given for scholarship of the highest quality on the subject of democracy. Joining us to host today's Ram Chat is Renew America Movement Board Advisor, Mindy Finn. Mindy, welcome.
Thank you, Mariana. All right. So Lee, thanks so much for being here. I really look forward to our conversation. I think, basically I'm going to divide these questions by some really short-term immediate things that we need to focus on in this, exercise of trying to protect and strengthen our democracy. And then, some things that might be more longer-term reforms or fixes. So starting with kind of the short term. So a big deal, the Senate, there's a new bill to protect voting rights. We're at a critical point right now. I think you've been tweeting a lot about this and talking a lot about this. How do you, I believe that you come on the side of that Senate Democrats should be willing to break the filibuster in order to advance voting rights. But can you talk about your position on that?
Yeah, that is my position. I think we're in a moment in which the kind of fundamental foundational principles of our democracy are being threatened. And the what's now called the Freedom to Vote Act, I think, would kind of stop some of that bleeding by putting some limits on what state legislatures can do to restrict voting rights, and also has some fixes to election subversion in the Electoral Count Act and some other provisions that I think are pretty essential to stop the bleeding right now. I certainly think that this is not something that should be held up by a filibuster. I would love it if Republicans in the Senate were willing to work with Democrats to come up with a compromise. And in an ideal world, we would have a bipartisan voting rights bill. But we are not living in an ideal world right now, far from it. And so I think this is a moment in which, if things have to be partisan, then things have to be partisan. The Republican state legislatures that have been rewriting voting laws to make it harder for Democrats to win elections and to protect their power are not trying to do things in a partisan way. And this is fundamentally the challenge of the doom loop that we're in, which is that it's a process of escalation around the core of our democracy. And for Democrats and for Congress to kind of not weigh in on this would be to, I think, put us on a slide into authoritarianism. I'm not saying it's a perfect bill. I'm not saying it's there are ways in which some might argue that it goes a little too far, but I think the alternative that's the alternative that is on the table, and I think it's a much better world and gives us a chance for a much better democratic future if we pass that bill as opposed to if we don't pass that bill.
Yeah. So, that's part of this challenge that we're in now, and that each party, each of the two parties tends to take this posture. They feel like they have to take this posture of being out partisaning the other, and keep kind of raising the stakes. I think that's part of what you talk about as the doom loop. So this is one of those moments that really demonstrates kind of what you talk about as this toxic doom loop. So how do we get out of it? I know you have a number of ideas for how we get out of it. Can you talk about right now, if you were to name the top 2 or 3 most important things that we could do as a country to get out of this doom loop, what would they be?
Well, I think the most important thing is first recognizing what the core of this doom loop is, and the core is our binary political system in which everything about our politics is winner take all, zero sum. And so that's what makes these fights over voting laws and elections so consequential and so high stakes and so nasty and dangerous, because we're in this 50-50 politics where if you can just somehow get to 51 by pushing your opponent to 49, you're on the verge of getting all of the power. So I think it's first understanding what the problem is. But when it comes to solutions, it's opening up that party space so it's not binary anymore, so that there's the potential for more political parties to be viable, and in particular for folks on the right who feel like the Republican Party has been hijacked by a bunch of Looney Tunes crazies, which it has, to be able to form a party and compete and offer a vision of the country that is not the Democrats' vision, but it's not the Looney Tunes Trump right vision either, which I think there's a lot of support for, and to build a different conversation. Right now, it's very hard for folks on the center right to find a home anywhere. I know there's various strategies about whether to fight back within the Republican Party, to kind of try to find a home in the Democratic Party, or to form a third party. But in our current two-party system, all of those paths are fraught. I'm following the German elections, and the AfD, which is the far-right party there, has kind of tottered out at about 11-12%. There's no chance that they're going to be in power. That's a multi-party system in which there's a center-right party that has been able to continue to compete without having to give itself over to the far right. And that's, I think, instructive. So I think in terms of specific legislation, if we had multi-member districts for the House with proportional ranked choice voting, that would open up the space. If we had ranked choice voting for the Senate, that would open up some space. That's what we can do right now. If we want to talk constitutional amendment, we can have a broader conversation, but I don't think we're in a space where we're going to do any constitutional amendments.
Yeah, and it's not just kind of center-right voters, kind of the Republican Party of old Bush and Romney type Republicans who are anti-Trump, who are without a home. I mean, the fact of the matter is the majority of the voters, even if they're not necessarily as alienated, or they don't feel as alienated from their party, they're dissatisfied with the direction of politics in the country today. I often kind of say one of the things that unites us all, or unites most of us, is that we're too divided.
Yeah.
And so kind of on that point, you recently, obviously you've been doing a lot of work around multi-parties and looking at the viability of that and what that might look like. You had a quiz that I think was fairly popular, released recently in the New York Times, where people could answer a series of questions and see where they would fall within kind of a hypothetical six-party system in the U.S. Talk about that quiz and how it came to be, and what you think some of the most interesting insights and takeaways are from that exercise.
Well, the quiz is, it's at the New York Times, so if folks haven't checked it out, they can check it out and see where they'd be. So, part of, my sense was that one obstacle to getting beyond this red-blue binary is a kind of a failure of imagination, that I think we have a hard time imagining what else our politics could look like, because we've been so surrounded by a particular approach to having elections and particular party system that it almost seems just natural, but it's not. It could be different. So, part of my hope was to just help people to imagine that. And so I imagined a six-party system with basically splitting the Democratic coalition into three parties, a progressive party, which would be, pretty far left, a new liberal party, which would be, pretty progressive on social issues, but a little bit more moderate on economic issues, and what I call the American Labor Party, which would be a little bit more moderate on social issues, but pretty solidly progressive on economic issues. And similarly with the Republican Party, a party that would be kind of center right on pretty centrist on social issues, but solidly free market on economic issues, which I call the Growth and Opportunity Party. A nod to the old GOP. It's kind of that Romney Republican Party. A kind of really solidly conservative, what I call the Christian conservative party that's, really free market and very focused on morality and conservative social values. And then what I call the Patriot Party, which is, extremely socially conservative and anti-immigration, but also a little bit more pro-government intervention in the economy, sort of kind of where Trump ran, though not necessarily governed. So people can take the quiz, see where they wind up. And one of the things that really struck me about the reaction to the quiz, which was really overwhelming, the extent to which people engaged with it, and people really seemed to latch on to these new identities and these new parties, even though it was just provided a short description, a few potential leaders. But it really gave me, a real confirmation of what my hypothesis was, which is that people really want more choices, and people feel like neither of the two parties really represents them all that well, and that I think a lot more people would feel better represented, better engaged in politics if they felt like they had a party that was really closer to their core values rather than being a party that compromises on a lot of their core values. So I think that was, for me, the most encouraging and biggest takeaway.
Yeah, and let me dig in on that a second. And this is kind of a point of personal privilege, because I look at, like you, look at these issues a lot, which is the role of the system today. So the rules that we have that govern who gets access to the ballot and who, ends up deciding election. And so there's this question, obviously, of the role in the primary, and I know you have a view on that. But I also think, and this is interesting kind of with the quiz. So the quiz is based on data that was captured at a moment in time. And what I've become kind of obsessed with is how allegiances and movements shift. I mean, there's enough data, we've been tracking over time to show that both parties ideologically have been moving further to their extremes at different rates, and all of that. But since 2004, they've further apart. There used to be more overlap ideologically, and they've been moving further apart. So there's obviously movement, and also today we're quite comfortable with Trump. Much more so than when he was rising in 2015 and 2016. So he did, in fact, while he was able to tap into something that already existed, the party. So where I'm this is, you talk about your hypothesis. Even though you have a party today that you might say is completely comfortable with, you have a primary in general on the Republican side that are distinct. Our primary base is more animated, has more out-party disdain. I know you've written by this, but ideologically, there's not that much dissent kind of within the main part of the base of the Republican Party today. What is your hypothesis on how people's views and attitudes and behaviors would change once they have a new identity to attach to? Like the identities that you presented in your quiz?
Well, I think that's a really important point, because one of the sort of long-standing and quite consistent findings in political science is that most people are partisans, not ideologues, and so that people's opinions and priorities change as the parties opinions and priorities change, and so you see a fair bit of movement on issues that become central to parties. Some of that is negative in that white liberals became a lot more racially progressive in response to Trump, because that was a kind of Trump defined what they were against. In the same way, I think you've seen that in administration. But there's only two potential ideologies that voters are offered right now, to the extent that most voters are partisans, or at least they engage in politics as partisans, and so that's rather limiting. I think if you had, say, 6 parties, what you'd see is, one, you'd see more voters focused on the actual policies they want rather than these that they're against, because when you have 6 parties, the whole idea of lesser of two evils, negative partisanship, goes away. Negative partisanship is really only a feature of a binary party system. So that, one, gives voters more of a sense of what they're actually for as opposed to what they're against. And I think you might see some of those parties shifting over time as they try to kind of carve out new identities. And you'd see voters kind of taking on a more engaged sense of what the policies are that they actually support, because they'd have a clearer sense of what are the options, rather than just I'm against Republicans or I'm against Democrats. So I think that would be a good thing, personally.
Yeah. So essentially, to summarize what you're saying, I think the system itself, which really is geared towards 2 parties, or biased towards only 2 parties, it's very difficult for other parties to compete in any real way, is having an impact on kind of what voters think they believe, because they're gravitating to the party line, and as you said, partisanship really trumps ideology, and we see evidence of that everywhere today. So thinking more to the future. So you talked about ranked choice voting as giving voters more choice and empowering them more in the process, fostering competition. Multi-member districts is not a new idea, but it's one that is getting a little bit more attention right now, I think, as folks who want to strengthen democracy are trying to get more, open up their imaginations to some changes we might make. Can you inform this group more about multi-member districts, what that actually means, what impact that would have?
Yeah, so multi-member districts have a long history in the United States. In fact, early in the 19th century, a large number of states elected their representatives to Congress through multi-member districts. However, these were not proportional multi-member districts. So, I mean, the concept is simple. Right now, we use single-member districts. There's the 12th district of Illinois is one district, 13th district is another. But if you had multi-member districts, you would simply combine, say, 5 districts into one larger district. So instead of electing 1 representative, you'd elect 5 representatives, and those representatives would be elected proportionally based on their vote share. So instead of having to get 51%, you could get, a party could get 20% and have a representative, and this would open up the opportunity space for more parties. This is what most democracies in the world do. Some countries have the entire country as one large multi-member district, which is elected proportionally. That's what Israel does, and the Netherlands does. That's probably an extreme form of proportional representation. A lot of countries have, more manageable districts, which I think would probably be ideal. I think five-member districts probably is going to offer the right balance that makes it harder for fringe parties to get seats, but gives a broad sense of representation. So that would mean that districts would be combined, and you'd see the ability for folks on the political right to get elected in places that now are only vote for Democrats, like cities and some. For example, Massachusetts, where Democrats have 9 out of 9 seats, despite being only about 65% of the electorate, you'd probably see a delegation in Massachusetts that was maybe 2/3 left, 1/3 right, maybe even closer. You'd see a couple different parties on the left and the right, and that would better represent the people of Massachusetts. You could generalize that to any state. I just use Massachusetts because it's kind of an extreme version of the way in which single member districts punish one party. And what that would mean is that the parties or the party coalitions in Congress would be more broadly representative of the electorate as a whole. Right now, we're getting a very skewed representation because the only Democrats that get elected are those in the most democratic parts of the country. And the only Republicans who get elected are those in the most Republican parts of the country. So we're getting a skewed representation that's more conservative and more liberal than the overall country. And this is not a function of primaries, it's a function of districting. And we talk a lot about primaries, and I mean, there's certainly I'm open to primary reform, but as you said, I've looked into this quite a bit, and looking at the research, it doesn't seem to matter the type of primary. You still get more or less the same ideological representation. So I think we need to look at districting, not primary reform, if we're going to have a real impact in who we elect to Congress.
Got it. I want to come back to that in a second, but in terms of proportional representation, there's issues that that kind of would take care of pretty quickly. So right now, as we kind of talked about districts, and I know it's obviously kind of well known, the most Democratic districts are like Democrats, the most Republican districts Republicans. We've been heavily gerrymandered. There's the number of swing districts is decreasing over time, where there's very few actual swing districts these days. So proportional representation would kind of address that. It also, gerrymandering or redistricting is highly politicized and highly competitive. Can you talk about, for the anti-gerrymandering activists that are tuned in here today, why proportional representation is helpful for achieving what they're going for?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's important to understand gerrymandering as a function of single member districts, because when you have single member districts with just two parties, it gives the party that controls the legislature and draws the map tremendous ability to pack the other party's voters into fewer districts and kind of distribute their voters much more efficiently. Now, this doesn't work when you have proportional multi-member districts. It just doesn't. You can only have gerrymandering to the extent that we have it with single member districts with just two parties, because when we have polarized parties, and you can kind of develop these computer maps and perfectly allocate your voters. With proportional districts, you can't squeeze out the other party's voters because they're going to get a share that is equal to their share. So with single member districts, getting 40% gets you 0 in a district. With proportional voting system, 40% gets you 40%. So it doesn't, the gerrymandering logic simply doesn't compute. It's the most efficient, quick way to get rid of gerrymandering. And, I'm certainly supportive of independent redistricting commissions, but I think one of the challenges is that you can't really make districts competitive when you have one party that is the party of the cities and one party that's the party of the exurbs, because to make competitive districts, you would have to draw these wacky districts that bring all these disparate communities together, that wouldn't make any sense and would generate really poor, even worse representation. And there's another aspect of making districts competitive that I don't think people appreciate, which is that if every district were competitive and you had a year that swung slightly to the Democrats could win like 400 seats. Or a year that swung slightly to Republicans could win 400 seats. So you actually don't, for fair partisan representation, you actually don't want lots of competitive districts, which is something that I think is not well appreciated. The way to have both districts that are both competitive and fair is to have proportional districts, which is, again, what most advanced democracies do in electing their legislatures.
Yeah. I mean, obviously this is proportional representation. There's precedent and models to follow in Europe and elsewhere. Do you see any downsides, or I guess to put it other ways, any ways that you think the American system is superior or has advantages compared to, democracies that rely on proportional representation?
I don't personally, but there are some who would argue that having a two-party system is a moderating feature, and that was, there was a long-standing argument that the U.S. system was moderate in having two, large catch-all parties that really did converge on the political center for a while, because we did have a two-party system, and the parties had to appeal broadly in order to get elected. I think that was not so much a feature of the two-party system, but the fact that the parties at a national level were incoherent, and that the parties, so in a sense, what we had in the U.S. for a long time was that we had a multi-party system within a two-party system, and that we had liberal Republicans from New England and conservative Republicans from the West. We had liberal Democrats in the North and conservative Democrats in the South, and that four-party system created a kind of loose-jointed, shifting coalitions that is typical of multi-party democracy. And so the truly radical departure is the last 10, 15, 20 years in which the U.S. has become a genuine two-party system with two highly sorted geographically parties and very nationalized politics. And I know there are some who would say, well, we should go back to an earlier era in which politics was more local and we had more federalism. And I think that did work, but I don't think you can unstir the jam out of the oatmeal at this point, that we are a nationalized polity. And as long as we have this power concentrated in Washington, the party in power is going to want to use that power. So getting to federalism without going through multi-party democracy is not going to work. So I think the other argument, of course, against proportional democracy is the proportional democracy enabled the Nazis to come to power, which is a strange canard, because I think the Nazis would have come to power even more easily with a two-party system. And in fact, it was the winner-take-all presidency, plurality presidency, that was a key feature of Hitler's rise to power. But the broader point there is that it does allow extremist parties to have a share of the electorate. And so if we had proportional democracy in the U.S., you would probably see a far-right party that is ethno-nationalist and illiberal, in the same way that you see it in lots of European democracies. Difference is that the other parties, the pro-democracy supermajority of Americans, and the parties that they elect could form a cordon sanitaire, a sort of coalition that keeps those far-right extremist parties out of power. And one of the things that you've been seeing with the far-right parties in Western Europe is that they're actually shrinking in popularity, and they're having a lot of internal fighting over the last several years, because when you don't have a shot at real power, you tend to have these internecine fights, and that undermines the far right. So I think that's if there's a certain amount of extremism in society, the question is what to do with it, and you either isolate it or you give it a chance to take over one of the two major parties. And when it takes over one of the two major parties, you kind of need at least two major parties that believe in democracy for democracy to function, which is why we're so screwed right now.
Okay, so the two-party system, some believe that was moderating. it was, we had a correlation for a time where we had a two-party system, and we also had moderating forces within the parties that kept them kind of at least in the center or more centered. And we had overlap between the two parties at one time ideologically, with more liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. And that's shifted. So we're in a different place now. And so, where there's more energy, I think, as over the last few years, and there's a little bit of precedent, rather than kind of multi-parties or something like proportional representation in the House, there's a lot of people have the idea of a third party. Obviously, we have third parties, we have libertarians, and we have Greens, and we have minor parties. But people think of, like, when they talk about a third party, I think what they're really saying is an independent, like someone being able to run as an independent for president, perhaps in a Senate race, and win. And so, Howard Schultz, obviously, I mean, Evan and I had our run, what we did, that was unique, but we're planning to launch a large scale, independent run, or exploring doing so in 2020. Andrew Yang, just talked about kind of wanting to, is that he really plans to, I guess, launch a third party with the launch of his book. So can you talk about, I mean, that's very more near term, I think, than when then getting to the 6 parties that you outline in the New York Times quiz. Can you talk about kind of the viability for an independent candidate, what some of the, if that would be a good thing and a good shakeup to the system, or, and I'll just sort of give away, I guess, my view is that the concern that rather than that kind of pushing the extremes to becoming more of a minor party, let's just talk about among Republicans, that could actually allow, quote unquote, the Nazis to come to power in the U.S. through a plurality.
Yeah, I think that's a real risk, particularly at the presidential level. And given a stark binary choice, which is what we have now, electing a third party candidate, runs. It could be very dangerous. Now, at a Senate level or at a House race level, I think there's some potential there, especially given that there's a lot of districts that are, solidly Republican or solidly Democrat. So to the extent that you could see like a Greg Orman style candidacy, he ran as an independent in Kansas, and for a while, seemed, pretty solid, although eventually fell off, or Lisa Murkowski in Alaska. If Democrats are not going to win in a lot of these states, and if Democrats could get behind a moderate Republican who then could attract some moderate Republicans, you might see, particularly in an independent candidacy, also Larry Pressler's run in South Dakota a few years ago. So I think that style of third-party independent candidacy could have some traction, and you could start to build a community of candidates and perhaps electeds who are supportive of broader reforms. So I think that has some possibility, but it's important to be strategic about the entry of candidates and not run in spoiler elections. There's also another theory that you could run in some competitive House districts as moderate Republicans who might steal away a little bit of the vote from a Republican candidate and help a Democrat win, but it could also cut the other way. One other way to think about it is to support fusion balloting, which would give a moderate Republican line to endorse a Democratic candidate, but would also allow moderate Republicans to say, this is us. We helped elect you, and maybe we'll be able to form our own political organization at some point. So there's a couple ways to think about it that are more intermediary. I think having some independent, centrist, moderate candidates in Congress would be an important beachhead for a reform movement with some actual voting power. I think there are certainly some members of Congress who are already supportive, but they just don't want to get too far ahead and too far out of line for fear of getting knocked down by the powers that be. But
yeah, I think we know that well. So this will be my last question. This has gone so quickly. I think we could talk about this for hours and hours. But
we sure could.
So I think we both share. Obviously, you talk about a lot the view that some system changes to our votings and elections could have really powerful effect on polarization, on citizen Americans' satisfaction with the system or ideological coherence, allow our government to function better, a whole series of benefits. But I sometimes wonder, and I want to take your view on this, we think about the various headwinds that we're up against. Yes, we used to have two parties and we did have moderation. Now we have a duopoly and we have two voters going to the extreme. So it's not the only variable. We know this. There's obviously geographic sorting. Maybe that is somewhat of an effect of the system. But social media and the rise of the internet and the information space and the highly unregulated information space certainly is another factor. And so what do you think about that? Like this idea that, I guess what I'm saying is, let's say tomorrow we snapped our fingers and suddenly we had a six-party system where most Americans would have an identity that made sense for them, that they could really attach to and feel good aligning with, a party they could feel good aligning with. How do you think that would kind of interact with some of the other headwinds we face in trying to unify as a country and function well and have some stability, like the information space and just obviously rampant disinformation and misinformation?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I'll start with the disinformation question. I think our disinformation, misinformation question is really a negative partisanship problem. I looked at there's a growing number of studies that look at the motivations of why people share disinformation and misinformation. And a lot of it is not that people don't, it's not that people are being tricked by the facts. It's that people are sharing these stories for expressive reasons. Because they really hate the opposing party, and they want to just kind of share it to be part of the team and to rag on the other team. So in politics, it's not. It's more that people are. It's not that people are ignorant of the truth as much as they are indifferent of the truth because they want their side to win. So one of the things that you see when you do cross-country comparisons, and I have a piece at 538 and summarizes this literature with the memorable title of the two-party system is "Effing Up American Democracy," that there's just less out-party hatred in multi-party systems, and there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that parties are not, the coalitions are shifting. So there's few permanent enemies. Democrats and Republicans are never going to be in coalition together, so they're always going to hate each other. But when you have shifting coalitions, parties see shifting alliances. Also, individual partisan attachments are not as strong because people might see themselves as voting for some different parties in different elections. And when those partisan attachments are weaker, then other national attachments can be stronger. So people are less likely to see the other party as enemies. Also, there's the fact that people in our current two-party system are very likely to be in social and professional and geographical networks where they are surrounded by people who are like them, and that both makes their partisan identity and their beliefs more extreme, and also leads them to stereotype and demonize the other. So that reifies that divide. But in a six-party system, chances are you're going to know a bunch of different people in different parties, and so you're going to hear different perspectives, and there's not going to be that demonization. Also, given the geographical sorting, in most multi-party democracies, you see a classical liberal party that is in the cities. So there's somebody offering kind of some right of center views in those urban networks, and you tend to see a left party in the more rural parts. It's maybe a more traditional labor working class party, slightly more conservative, but there's not that same demonization where that one part of the country is going to feel completely locked out if the other part has power. It'll take some time, and it will depend on leadership, but I think the incentives change quite profoundly. The social networks change quite profoundly. The underlying strategies around negative polarization and demonization change quite profoundly, and that that really has some very powerful effects.
Yeah, and so there's obviously the finding and the saying a lot in politics is that politics is downstream of culture. But what I hear you saying is that some of our culture is actually downstream of politics, or at least our socialization. So really what you're imagining here, or kind of hypothesizing and expecting, is that it'd be less, if we had more parties, it'd be less kind of always the Bloods versus the Crips. And, this place we're in now where so many Republicans say they never want, they would be like the terrible, awful thing if one of their children married a Democrat, and vice versa. There's this huge fear. It's kind of easier to say that than to say, well, you can't marry a green, yellow, red, orange, or purple because we're blue. So I think that obviously would be quite powerful. So with that, Lee, thank you so much for doing this. This has been a ball. Hopefully we can, if not do another one of these, we can keep continuing this conversation offline. I'm sure that we will.
Yes.
Thank you for your time and for all the work that you do on these issues to make our country healthier and more sane. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mariana.
Thank you, Mindy and Lee, for a fantastic conversation. Seriously, we could have gone on so much longer, and there was just so much amazing information and real great insight from both of you. So I thank you both, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you enjoyed this conversation, please check out our other RAM chats on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Renew America Movement. And be sure to join us, mark your calendars, for September 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern for our next RAM chat, where we will host U.S. Senate candidate from Pennsylvania, Craig Snyder. In the meantime, to stay up to date with everything Renew America Movement is doing and how you can tune in for our next RAM chat by following us on Twitter @Renew America, and sign up on our website for all of the information on how you can get involved with us, renewamericamovement.com. Have a fantastic rest of your week, and we'll chat soon. Bye, guys.